Hello once again. Okay, this time we're gonna talk about ecosystem. Ecosystem. Yes. Now, in this topic, we need to understand what is the so-called food chain and food web, and what are the different trophic level. Okay, so let us start. What do you mean by the word ecosystem? Okay. Ecosystem is the union of biotic and abiotic factors. Now, two terminologies arise from there: biotic and abiotic. From the word itself, bio, which means life, and the other one is with a, abiotic. So, biotic factors includes the plants and animals, and the abiotic factors that includes sunlight, water, and the land, of course, itself, plus the air in the surroundings. Okay, so in a certain place where living organisms compete each other and actually it's their habitat, then we call it niche. Okay. Now, in that ecosystem, they used to interact each other. Maybe they are interacting, it's because they need each other. One, for the food, for the place where they can live or their habitat, for the amount of sunlight, and for the water. Yes. So, the main focus there is the competition for their food. Now, there are two important functions of ecosystem. One, the capture and the use of energy by the living organisms, and the second is the cycling of nutrients needed by organisms. Okay, how does it happen, the cycling, and how does this capturing and using of energy takes place? Okay, now to understand this fully, we need to understand the different trophic level. Different trophic level. One, we have the so-called producer. Who are those producer? Can you tell me an example of any plants that they don't have a green coloring? How do they manufacture their own food? How do they produce their own food? Have you seen this so-called poinsettia? This Christmas plants in the Philippines, we call it Christmas plants, but in Africa, in any month of the year, it always grows nicely and the color is red. How do they manufacture food if they don't have the green color? Okay, so come to think of that. But let me tell you, all the plants can manufacture their own food. So that is why all the plants is considered as producer. Though there are special kind of organisms that can also produce their own food, like the bacteria. Now, how come that the bacteria can make their own food? Yes. Now, let's talk about first the plants. The plants, when they make their own food, how do you call that process? The process is called photosynthesis. What are these three raw materials needed by the plant, which is there in the ecosystem? That's why we are talking about energy use, or use and capturing of energy. So in the process of photosynthesis, the plants needs carbon dioxide, which is in the surroundings. Carbon dioxide exhaled by the people as well as the as well as the animals. We also need sunlight, plus the water, and the energy that comes from the soil, of course, and the nutrients that comes from the soil. So, from there, they can produce now their own food. Okay, do you still remember this process of building up and using it up, or the metabolic process as well as the anabolic process? In the metabolic process, in the building, what are those things involved? Okay. And then with the anabolic process, what can you tell me about that one? Then it will looks like the photosynthesis. The photosynthesis is the making of food, while the respiration is the opposite of that. It's because in the respiration, whatever the raw materials of the photosynthesis, that one is the end result of respiration. Okay? If I am not mistaken, yes. Now, let's continue the different trophic level. One is the producer. The producer is also known as the autotrophs. Autotrophs. The second one now are the consumers. The consumers including the human being, all the animals. In this consumer class, we have the so-called primary, secondary, and tertiary. So with the primary consumer, it means to say that if I planted a vegetable and I harvested it, I cooked and ate that one, I am now the primary consumer. If I will be eaten by worm and decompose, then the worms are the secondary consumer. And if that worms will be eaten by the chicken now is called the tertiary consumer. But it will go through a process of decomposition. So, therefore, we have now 3 trophic level: producer, consumer, and decomposers. Okay, so with that process of the consumers, here comes now the so-called the feeding of the organisms with those nutrients. That is now the so-called the food chain. What is the difference between a food chain and a food web? The food chain, it is a cycle. So that's why a while ago I mentioned to you that in an ecosystem there are 2 main functions. The cycling now of the nutrients. Okay? The food chain, that is how each and every organism has been fed by the producer. And then from there, if it will be involved with a lot of organisms eating one another, then here comes now the food web. The food web is the interconnection of the food chain, or a combination of a food chain. So that is the difference between the 2. Okay, so the decomposer class. The decomposers, those includes bacteria and fungi, which obtain food from dead organisms. They are the one who decompose the living organisms. Now, on the primary consumer before, we have the so-called herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Okay, try to recall those previous knowledge of us in biology during our secondary days. If we are talking herbivores, then in human being we can call it vegetarian. So they are only feed with plants. And carnivores or carnivorous. Carnivores are those consumers who feed with animals, the meat of animals. And the omnivores, it's a combination, plants and animals. Okay, so that one is very clear to understand. Those are the different trophic levels in the ecosystem. Okay, so I hope you learn from this, and then from there we can proceed to the ecological succession. And for now, you can make your own illustration of a food chain and can be composed of a different food chains so that you can make the so-called food web. For now, that's all for today, and thank you for listening. Watch for our next video.